overview about what you're going to be seeing tonight. It's a series, I think, now of about 60 pictures, and hopefully we'll run through them in about 30 minutes. All the pictures that you're going to see tonight were taken in Philadelphia in the year 2020 and try to tell a story of a year which not only saw a mighty pandemic, but also sustained racial justice protests following the death of George Floyd, and then a pivotal presidential election in November of that year. Images are going to be presented with their dates, and then I may share a comment or two about describing the image or giving some context so you can understand it as I intend. If you have any questions about a particular photo, just note the date or note the subject, and we'll be happy to come back to that after the conclusion of the presentation. So let's now start our journey, remembering Philadelphia in 2020, a review of a tumultuous year. So the year started as normal, and the yet unknown virus was getting ready to take hold, but we just did not know it. The mummers here in this picture are marching down Broad Street, not knowing that their parade is going to be canceled the following year because of COVID. Also, on the right side of the image, you can see the art house, the beginnings of the art house condominiums, which is now a completed 47-story building. As they have officially since 1901, mummers in their ornate costumes entertained people on this really beautiful, sunny January 1st day. Here's a picture of one of the mummer trees that miraculously sprout up on every new year on Broad Street, as revelers need to find a place to hang their empty cans of beer and other things after finishing their favorite beverage. Here's a picture of Independence Hall on a wet evening. 2020 started with protests, but on different issues that would surface later on in the year. This group of people pictured on Walnut Street was protesting on January 4th against the war with Iran or Iraq. This scene from Rittenhouse Square. It was an unusually warm evening this January night, I think in the 50s. People just hanging out. And here's a picture of the Apple Store on Walnut Street. You all know it. You're going to be seeing this image twice again in this presentation. But tonight, you see it here on January 11th, and people visiting the store normally. And here on March 8th, this was 2 days before the first confirmed case of COVID-19 in Philadelphia. A sparse crowd is here at Penn's Landing, and it was really quite another beautiful Sunday. The ice rink would close at the end of the day here on March 8th as normal. So they were not impacted by any kind of COVID closures. When the ice rink did reopen in November of 2020, there'd be strict capacity limits and masking requirements would be in place. The other thing you might want to look at in this picture is to the north side of the ice rink. You see a large concrete tower standing there. Many of you might recognize that, and you'll see another slide on this in just a few minutes. Empty shelves were the first sign of the many disruptions that we were going to experience. This picture on March 13th was taken just 3 days after the first confirmed COVID case in Philadelphia. Some of the uh, some of the earliest public health precautions were seen in Chinatown prior to the masking practice becoming widespread. You see this woman here on March 15th. She's not wearing one mask, she's wearing two masks. And Chinatown really was leading the way in that regard early in the pandemic time. Customers were far and few between at the Reading Terminal Market on March 16. The city would announce later that day that non-essential businesses had to close at 5 p.m. through at least March 27th. But of course, we know that the lockdown lasted much longer than that. And although the market was still open when this picture was taken, business, as you can see, was sharply curtailed. And you can see at the back of the picture here, these two sales clerks just waiting, just standing there with absolutely nothing to do. When was the last time you ever saw that at Reading Terminal Market? Here, the Ritz 5 Theater on Dock Street didn't have a film to put on their marquee. We're now at the end of March 24, and hospitals all throughout the city erected these triage tents, including here at Pennsylvania Hospital on Spur Street. And businesses, including many restaurants, secured their property for what they anticipated would be a pretty prolonged closure, like these restaurants did on 2nd Street in Old City. You also see a couple out jogging. That was one of the permissible exceptions to the stay-at-home order, which was then in effect. Public messaging urged everyone to stay home. Street scenes were transformed by the absence of people. And although not preparing food, this ordinarily busy Wawa near Independence Mall was otherwise open as an essential business, except there were no customers. This store was open at the time that this picture was taken. And overall, the city had this eerie quality about it. This photo being taken sometime in the late rush hour. I think this was taken about 6:30 or 7 o'clock, a time when you ordinarily would see lots of activity. But here you see nothing at all. There were so few cars on the road And if you did drive, it was really a pleasure to drive around without any traffic in Philadelphia. And parking was also very easy to find in the commercial areas, except, of course, most businesses weren't open. Public health messaging was prominently displayed throughout the city, reminding people to practice social distancing and other things. So here's the Apple Store again. This is April 13th, and we're now right in the middle of the public health-based business closures. And the Apple Store here on Walnut Street almost seems to be teasing people with their bright lights, showing off what they have inside, but they couldn't have any people in the store. They could not have any customers. And businesses bided their time until they could reopen, like this restaurant on Rittenhouse Square. Restaurants, of course, were unable to serve in their dining rooms. So this photo peers through a window into what was then something forbidden. Some restaurants were able to adapt to the new routine. And here, a window that might have never been opened before was pressed into service for takeout at a Mexican restaurant in the Callow Hill neighborhood. The TLA, the Theater of the Living Arts on South Street, was here sending a positive message out to people just to sort of, yo, Philly, stay safe. This is April 24. Fittingly, the Theater of the Living Arts became one of the very first vaccine centers in Philadelphia. And some of you may have gotten your first shots there. To encourage social distancing, Mural Arts Philadelphia, the group that is in charge of all the murals in the city, featured a number of different graphics called space paths. These were 14-inch vinyl squares that were laid down on the sidewalk. And you can, in this picture, already see the pavement coming through the vinyl and wearing away on what was intended to be just a temporary message. This message of caring, take care of each other, Philly, was found on the Magic Gardens on South Street. Now we get to May 30. The end of May started a series of racial justice protests following the murder of George Floyd just days earlier in Minneapolis. Crowds came together, but they were conscious of personal space, often grouping themselves into pods. Signs and masks, they were plentiful throughout the crowd that day. A peaceful day of protests gave way to a night of madness. This shot from NBC 10 shows one of the police cars burning in the late afternoon, which would then be followed by widespread looting in several areas of the city later that evening. It was just total mayhem. Scarred pavement from the prior evening. Ordinary citizens came out to help in the cleanup, as you see these people doing in front of a broken window on Walnut Street. Businesses were business areas were largely desolate as times were uncertain. This was COVID meeting the George Floyd riot, and people just were not going out. This photo from the Italian market just shows how few people were out on the street. And in the far view, you see a mural of Frank Rizzo, the former mayor and police commissioner. Let me now show you a close-up of that mural. The mural had been a subject of vandalism over the many years that it had been up on the building. And here it was splattered with paint just days before this picture was taken on June 4th. The mural would be entirely painted over just days later, as the mural was declared by the mural group to be a painful reminder for many of the former mayor's legacy. You'll see another picture of this in just a minute. So this is the week after the riots in Philadelphia, and businesses braced for further unrest. By this time, the National Guard had arrived in the city. You see the police, you see the National Guard, and you see this religious figure who is promoting harmony to some very angry, people there. He was really trying to keep the peace. It was a very tense time. Let me just go back on that if I can. Taking public health measures, people came. People came out to protest. The protests were peaceful and drew fairly large numbers. And you also might look at the flag at half-mast here. This is the city flag at half-mast, and this was done in recognition not only of the George Floyd murder, but also the victims of COVID-19. Here are some supporters on horseback. Masked drummers performed for the crowd. Meanwhile, a Penn's Landing icon was being demolished. We saw this picture earlier on the north side of the skating rink picture. This tower was built in 2002 as part of a failed plan to support cable car service over the Delaware to Camden. Called the Skylink Aerial Tramway, those plans were abandoned, and this was coming down on June the 7th. As the city started to crawl back to normal, the city life started to get back to normal, the flower stand at Rittenhouse was again open. City government started to loosen the lockdown in early June, and businesses reopened with limited capacity and masking requirements. Mask wearing would become ubiquitous in public places for the remainder of the year. Some companies were eager to show their support for the racial justice movement. This mural, painted on plywood that had been erected originally to protect the stores from rioters, were now painted over with this mural. And this is the Apple Store. So this is the third time that you're seeing the Apple Store tonight. This picture from June the 20th. Shop windows displayed the latest in fashion. Outdoor dining and food delivery became routine for many. Here you see the Rizzo mural on 9th Street again. It's all painted over, except for the very top right of it, which you can see unpainted. And if you're down on 9th Street today, uh, it remains this way. It remains mostly this way today, and you can actually see the mural faintly coming through the covering coat of paint. So it still looks very much like this today. If you remember, this year also featured a protest for housing rights. Over 100 tents comprised an encampment along the Ben Franklin Parkway, protesting both for housing and racial justice. These tents were there for months until an agreement was reached with the city providing for some very minor housing reforms. And then they cleared out. Here we are in the middle of July. Protests are still continuing. Here at the end of August is a scene from South Street. September the 4th, the summer is over. And it was different this year. You know, very different feel to the end of summer. Outdoor dining options here were set up outside along Reading Terminal Market. The city would permit the resumption of indoor dining just a few days after this picture was taken. And when they did, that was, of course, subject to social distancing and capacity limits and other public health measures. Political organizers posted early reminders that a pivotal election was coming. And you saw this as early as September. And although the city had now allowed the resumption of indoor dining, outdoor dining would be common for a considerable period of time, as it was for this restaurant at the corner of 13th and Sansome. Political activism continued. As we got closer to November, the protests would emphasize a change in the White House. City improvements continued as to this renovation of the pavilion in Love Park. The upcoming election would get more and more attention as we got closer to November, and people were encouraged to make their plans to vote. Racial justice continued to loom large in the election, and there was a series of murals put up in Love Park, including this one that said, "Vote for those who can't breathe anymore." Here are some other voting messages there as part of that collection. Support for racial justice were found in many different areas of the city. Here we are now, November the 7th. This was the Saturday after the presidential election, and people started to gather by the convention center where votes from Philadelphia were being tabulated. And after waiting days without knowing who won the election, the Associated Press would call Pennsylvania for Biden just before noon, giving him a majority in the Electoral College. At City Hall that same day, everyone seemed to relish the moment. Many people were taking photos with their cell phones. This was a day that they would want to remember. A parade on Market Street. I'll just go back there. Hold on. And on Independence Mall. It was really a joyous day, November the 7th, Saturday. Beautiful day. And people were just very relieved that Biden was elected president. A modified Christmas village carried on around City Hall. It was smaller this year, but it did take place. You'll note the hand sanitizing station on the left. People were encouraged to use that. And you also see a t-shirt on the bottom there of this particular store featuring Ben Franklin wearing a mask. And note the expression, bad things happen in Philadelphia. That only became a saying a couple of months before, after Trump made that statement during a presidential debate earlier in September, when he was complaining about voting irregularities. Some Philadelphians would take pride in that message and would wear that on a t-shirt. All in all, it was a very subdued holiday celebration that year. And now let me show you the last image for this evening. Taken on December 25th. The City Tavern at 2nd and Walnut Street, like many businesses, was a victim of 2020. Forced to close in March, when all restaurants had to do so, the City Tavern would never reopen. This plywood cutout of a figure from revolutionary times, originally used to draw customers to the restaurant when it had been operating, had now been adorned by someone with a surgical mask. An apt image for us to close our look back at Philadelphia in 2020, a year we might otherwise want to forget.